The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is out with its perspective on the prospects for a deal in Copenhagen. The Chamber's Institute for 21st Century Energy has a report, and it's called The Prospects for Copenhagen. More realism can smooth the way. It says development of advanced energy technologies is the single most important factor in determining the speed and the cost of greenhouse gas emissions cuts. It concludes leaders must ensure that, among other things, a new global climate deal sets realistic goals, recognizes a growing energy needs, ensures global participation, and does not weaken intellectual property. With me now is one of the authors of that report, Stephen Eule. He's the Institute's Vice President for Climate and Technology. Steve, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And we appreciate it. So more realism can smooth the way. You guys are talking a lot about that your organization does want a very strong deal out of Copenhagen, but that the prospects for such a deal are not very bright and that it's not hard to see why. Tell us why.
Well, I think the prospects for a deal in Copenhagen, for a comprehensive deal in Copenhagen, aren't very bright, but I do think that Copenhagen is going to be an important step on the way to what will eventually be a comprehensive agreement that will be ratifiable by the Senate. So Copenhagen is a very important event on the way there. And we think there are a number of very, very difficult issues that have to be faced, and we've outlined a bunch of those in the report. These include finance, technology transfer, how to handle intellectual property rights, those sorts of things. So these are very contentious issues that are of very keen interest to the business community, and something we'll be taking a close look at.
Right. So it looks like from your report the biggest challenges being faced by all nations are the same ones that we reported on from Barcelona: emissions reductions targets, the financing mechanism, technology transfer, and things like that. Do you see a progress having been made in the talks so far through Bonn, Barcelona? Bilateral talks are happening this week in China. Are you optimistic that will help get us there so that this framework agreement, which seems to be what you're talking about, what most people are now talking about, can be done there?
Well, I think there is the political will to get a framework agreement done in Copenhagen. I think what we've seen is small incremental steps at each stage of the negotiation along the way throughout the past year. But I think it is going to be difficult to come up with the details. Everybody's interested in the details, and I think those will have to come later. And from our perspective, we would love to see a comprehensive agreement coming out of Copenhagen, but we're realistic about that. And we think if it takes 6 months after that or a year after that, we just as soon have a good agreement rather than no agreement.
Doesn't appear to be too much more time if it's not, in 4 weeks from now. You're talking about in this report unprecedented technology challenges. What specifically are those?
Well, I think there are a number of them. When you think about the scale and scope of the revolution in energy systems that has to take place over really a relatively short period of time, 40 years, it's clear that existing technologies can play an important role. Energy efficiency can certainly play an important role. But to get the cuts and emissions reductions that we really need, and at a cost that's politically and economically acceptable, we really need advanced technologies to come to the fore. Things like carbon capture and storage. We need to lower the cost of solar and wind technologies. We need advanced nuclear technologies. There's a whole suite of technologies that we need if we're going to cut emissions economically.
There are a lot of groups like yours coming out with reports and talking to us on our shows about what's needed in Copenhagen, and most of it is really not arguable. Everyone seems to know what we need out of Copenhagen, with some little differences. Not everybody thinks nuclear should be a part of it, and many do. What are you offering here? What's the purpose of this report? Are you saying how to get those things that are needed?
Well, I think the purpose of the report is to educate the people on the scale and scope of the challenge that's ahead of us, number one.
And this is for policymakers, or?
For policymakers and for the general public. We often talk about emission cuts of 20%, 50%, 80%. What does that mean in actual hardware, in actual energy systems on the ground, transforming those systems? So I think that's one of the things we want to get across, how challenging this is. And then I think we offered a way forward. The focus is on technology. Technology is going to be the key. It's the solution. It will help us reduce emissions while keeping our economies humming. So we think that a new agreement that's focused on technology is something that can bring developing countries and developed countries together. Right now they're at loggerheads, and we're looking for a way that we can get more cooperation instead of confrontation.
I guess, do you think we need the deal and we need the legislation out of the U.S. in order to spur that technology development? And another big challenge is the speed at which it can come to the rescue.
Yes, absolutely. The emission reductions that are being talked about in the domestic legislation are very steep. We're looking at 1 billion metric ton reduction by 2020. It's very difficult to get to. Just to give you an example, if we were to shut down half the coal fleet in the U.S., we'd have to build 130 1-gigawatt nuclear reactors to replace those, and that would save us 1 gigaton of CO2 emissions. So it's a pretty daunting task.
Yes, and I mean, seeing the daunting tasks ahead, do you see the U.S. coming to the table in Copenhagen with some hard numbers on emissions reduction targets and funds for the developing nations?
That's a very
well, it's the question of the day.
It's the question of the day. I don't know if they will come to the table with hard numbers at this point. I think the administration is has learned the lesson of Kyoto. Don't come to the table and agree to something that you can't back up.
Right. So the president says he'll go if it's if there's a deal just about to be made and his presence will clinch it, then he'll show up.
Right. I think that's probably right. Yeah.
Your report says more realism can smooth the way. What's happening that's not realistic?
Well, I think the demands, for example, on wealth transfer by developing countries isn't realistic.
The demands that developing nations want?
Developing nations are making demands on developed countries for anywhere from 0.5% to 2% of GDP to support climate change activities in developing countries. Politically, I don't see that happening. And quite frankly, the governments don't have that type of money. If the U.S. were to devote 0.5% to 2% of its GDP in 2008, that would have been about $70 billion to $290 billion. Politically, I don't see that as being realistic. But you have to recognize that a lot of that money is going to have to come from the private sector. So the private sector is very interested in how the financing is structured so that it's willing to play in the game. Right.
Let me get your reaction to a comment by the Center for American Progress. Andrew Light gave us a comment on your report. He calls it a curious document, and he says that it argues that the global goal of cutting emissions by half by 2050 will be challenging and complicated, but offers no real suggestions on how those challenges can be met. He says everybody realizes the task is challenging, especially of enticing major carbon emitters in the developing world to take on sufficient emissions reductions of their own to meet that 50-50 goal. So he says this all isn't news, and that what your report omits is acknowledgement of the ample strides that the developing nations like China, India, and Brazil, Indonesia are making to cut their emissions, and how much they've announced they are prepared to do if we do get a good deal in December. And that by leaving out that part of the story, this report misrepresents the true state of progress on getting us to where we need to be.
Well, first of all, I would say, yes, a number of developing countries have come forward with plans of their own. But those plans don't come anywhere near what's needed to achieve a 50% reduction in global emissions by 2050. The big issue is, what is the cost of that? It's always a question of cost, and that's why we focus on the technologies in this report. Technologies can lower the cost of reducing emissions, and if you lower the cost, you open up a fuller range of policy options to policymakers that are politically and economically acceptable. And one thing we highlight in the report is a number of things we can do now. We can reduce the time it takes to site and permit clean energy facilities. We can reduce tariffs. There's no excuse that we still have tariffs on clean energy goods and services. So we point to a lot of things that we can do now that helps lower the cost of these technologies so that we can deploy them more cost effectively and more widely.
Okay. All right. Stephen Eule from the Chamber's Institute for 21st Century Energy. We'll see you in Copenhagen.
Yes, we will.
We hope to. Here's your report, and it's available on your site.
It is indeed, energyxxi.org.
Okay. Steve, thanks.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.